All right. So, bit of housekeeping again. This week, starting a fresh week here. I'm going to talk a little bit about assignments, bit of feedback for those. I've gone through and graded any submissions for assignment 2 and 1 that were submitted last week. So, grades should be up to date as of today. We'll talk a bit about what's going to go on for this week, our kind of plans, going through the task list there. And then we'll get started with some kind of lecture and a little bit of time for you guys to work on some practice problems or the new assignment that comes out this week as well. So, starting out here, I'm going to. I won't share my screen just yet. So for assignment 2, largely pretty happy with how those came out. A lot of perfect grades on those assignments. If you aren't finished assignment 1, you haven't handed it in yet. We're kind of starting assignment 3 this week, so you're a decent amount behind the curve now. It would probably be a good idea to start getting finished assignment 1, especially, and then assignment 2 as well. Like I mentioned, assignment 3 is coming out this week. We'll kind of talk about that later as well. For assignment 2, though, largely very well done. A few things. I'll share my screen and just kind of give a bit of a demonstration here. Going to my AutoCAD here. Let me open this guy here. So I have a sample of a completed copy of assignment 2 here. The main kind of thing was just precision based. I don't think anyone had much significant trouble with drawing this shape specifically. Uh, when it came to precision, just keep in mind this assignment in particular, we just covered drawing with precision. So of course, I'm going to be focusing mostly on your precision when you draw. So when it came to a lot of these circles here, a lot of the exterior circles, it was generally the either radial distance, so the distance from the center point out to these external circles was a bit out, just very slightly in the decimal places, or the angle itself from the center point to these external circles. Those angles might have been just very slightly out again. But of course, we're looking specifically for drawing with precision, so I was a bit more strict with the exact precision of those of the placement of those circles. So as a bit of a pointer for both those of you that have handed it in, those of you that might be still working on it, since we talked about drawing with precision, I'm generally expecting you to use the precision tools that we kind of talked about. So things like object snap tracking, object snaps themselves, polar tracking, polar snap if you choose to use it, that kind of idea. So when you're placing some of these external circles here, the vertical ones and the horizontal ones here that are on the 0, 90, 180, 270 degrees, those kinds of circles there, were generally pretty good. Because if I set my polar tracking to something like 90 degrees, it's pretty straightforward to use. I draw the largest circle or the internal circle in the center point here first, because I can have my specific starting coordinates that were listed in the diagram. I can use those starting coordinates as the center point for either this interior centermost circle or this external largest circle. So if I start at those specific coordinates, 105, I believe it was 175, then I can start at that exact center point and make the first circle. That was generally pretty well done. So if I now have that center point snap, I can use that center point snap. If I make sure I activate it here, I'm just going to disable a couple others so don't get in the way. I can then use that center point snap, hovering over it with my object snap tracking as well, and then get those tracking lines to determine the distance away from that point, which would be my radial distance. So these ones on the right here, these I believe 10 diameter typical circles, I can use that tracking line specify the exact radius, 50. Oh, if I track that properly, 50, and then I get exactly 50 units away from that center point. There were a couple cases where the distance was just very slightly out. What I figure happened was maybe you did use object snap tracking, but when you had this tracking line, you didn't exactly type in the numbers. Remember, I just have to hover over that object snap, and then as long as I have the tracking line visible, I can just type in the radius that I need across that tracking line. So typing in 50, I think I accidentally grabbed the quadrant there. So I've highlighted the center point. Using that tracking line, type in 50. And then when I hit enter, this is placed exactly 50 units away from the center point that I snapped to. What might have happened was that you did use the tracking line here, and then you kind of eyeballed it from here. So if I get rid of that circle and redraw it here, you might have come along this line, and where on your dynamic input it says center point, you might have eyeballed it here where it says 50. AutoCAD's being a little deceiving here, where my dynamic input says 50 and at 0 degrees, but if I were to click and draw this circle here, proper radius, the kind of hidden part of this assignment that was a bit of a catch, bit of a pitfall, was that the drawing units on this drawing are not specified to show decimals. So if I go into my drawing utilities, units, I can turn up my decimal precision here. And this is how I went and kind of graded and checked if you did drawing precision. I cranked up the decimal precision on both the lengths and the angles. And then I went ahead and checked what that length was. So since I eyeballed it and I just clicked along the tracking line, AutoCAD was being a bit deceiving to me there. It wasn't showing decimals. So now that I've cranked up the precision, it's showing me those decimals, and I can see that it's not exactly 50 units. Whereas if I use the tracking line and then go across and type in 50, AutoCAD's not going to assume decimals because I didn't type in decimals. So when I type in 50 and hit enter, put in my radius here, and then again, go to check that distance, it's precisely 50 units. Same if you did any angles. The angles you'd have to do a bit different. If you tried to draw a tracking line prior to having this circle existing here. So if I was doing this 45-degree circle here, and if I turn my precision back down, and you just try to make a tracking line here, and you see on the dynamic input it says 45 degrees, and if I try to eyeball this again, it says 50 and it says 45 degrees, 50 length, 45 for the angle. If I click and then try to start my circle using that endpoint snap, and then just type in 10 here, I can go in, again, change my precision back up, and then see that the angle is actually 43.269 degrees, and the length is 50.139. So hanging decimals again, imprecise placement. The kind of better way to do this, since it's not 90 degrees, I have to change my polar tracking angles. So from where it was 90 degrees, I now have to change it to something like 45. And with 45 degrees, I now get that same tracking line, just at an angle. So this is now exactly 45 degrees because it's on the tracking line that's been specified. And then again, I can type in the radial distance, exactly 50, hit enter, put in my radius, hit enter, and now this is more exact. Okay, so it's not showing any hanging decimals because those decimals places don't exist. So it's just kind of a precision thing that kind of need to watch out for. Again, you might think this is like overly strict. I was only 0.05 of a decimal place out or something like that. But again, it ends up cascading when we do larger projects. If one of our projects further down the line is designing the lighting for a hockey rink, if you're out by like 0.05 of a meter for a row of lights, and we're doing like 20 rows of lights, we're going to eventually be out a full meter by the time you get to the 20th row of lights, right? So it's not that it's imprecise just by a hair and I'm being really strict. It's that if you continually make imprecise placements, they can kind of cascade to the point where it's a very obvious error. And then if it's out by a meter and you hand that drawing off to someone that's going to construct this, then they're going to think it's supposed to be out by a meter and they're going to build it like that and it's going to be completely wrong, right? Especially in cases like if you're doing something like a PLC panel or something like that and you're trying to design it and you have all these wires going everywhere in a bunch of different modules, at some point, if you're out by that tolerance again and it's imprecise and you hand it off to someone else, they start cramming all this stuff into their panel and they realize it doesn't all fit in there. So if we have very specific constraints like that, you get to the point where the project just functionally doesn't work because of that imprecision. Okay. So that's pretty much the main thing with assignment 2. It was just precision, really. Starting coordinates were all fine. The PDF print plots were all fine. Nothing too bizarre was going on. So that's pretty much all I have to comment about assignment 2. Any questions about assignment 1 or 2 for your submissions or anything like that? All good. Like I've mentioned in the past as well, I've given you feedback on both assignment 1 and 2. You're free to do those edits, make it more precise, do whatever adjustments you need to do. You can resubmit it just to the same Dropbox folder. I see that there's new submissions in there. It notifies me every time there's new submissions. I just go look at them. I update your grade accordingly. Okay? And if you find that there's any errors in the grading as well, if it looks like I grabbed the wrong drawing and it's not your drawing that has these edits on it, something weird like that, just bring it up, send me an email, and I'll fix that as well. Okay? So, just double check here. Okay, so that's about it for assignment 2. What I'm going to do is go over our agenda for this week as well. So I'm going to share my screen again here. I'm going to flip over to our task list for this week. So, again, new weekly folders opened up for you guys here. You should have access to the week 5 folder now. In here is our task list. Same resources as per usual, going over the actual tasks themselves for this week. We're going to go through chapter 6. Chapter 6 is very similar to chapter 3. If you kind of recall, our first assignment was chapter 3, the project chapter. Every 3 chapters or so in the textbook is a project chapter. So in the case of chapter 6, it's also a project chapter where we're going to do some practice examples and kind of go through them just for some extra kind of verification that you understand what we've covered in chapters 4 and 5, which is mostly our editing tools. So it's going to be quite practical or lab heavy for this week. It's more so you guys working on stuff, and then I'm available if you have any questions or want to verify your drawings or anything like that. Task 2 in here as well. Complete extra practice 3. This isn't entirely true in this task list here. Extra practice 3 looks like this. Again, just in the extra practice folder on Brightspace. The thing with extra practice 3 is that you should be able to draw this object here for extra practice 3, but the instructions listed mention drawing center lines, drawing dimensions, and using specific layers. When it comes to steps 4 and 5 here, We haven't talked about center lines or dimensions yet, so don't expect to be able to do those just yet. When it comes to drawing the actual object itself, this kind of rounded plate here with these drilled holes, you should be able to draw that with just standard drawing tools and some of our editing tools as well. The dimensions, again, we haven't covered yet, so don't expect that you're kind of behind or anything if you can't do it. We haven't talked about dimensions or center lines just yet. Okay? So if you do want to do extra practice 3 and get kind of a head start on it, you can get started by drawing the actual object, just not the dimensions. Finally, for task 3 this week, assignment 3 opens up for us. The thing with assignment 3 as well is that it's going to require us to use some commands and some tools that we haven't yet talked about. So what I'm going to do for today is the first little section here. I'm going to go over some of the tools that are required for assignment 3. So we will start with some lecturing, but largely this week is mostly kind of hands-on time, working with a lot of our practice problems or with assignment 3 itself. Okay, so today we're going to talk about some of those tools required for assignment 3, things like the measuring tool, a few of the advanced editing commands like offset, trim, array, those kinds of tools. And we're going to talk about text. So actually putting lettered text onto our drawings as well. Okay. I'll make an announcement on Brightspace as well, talking about what we covered today, so you can reference it back, just in case you do work on assignment 3 later on in the week, and you just kind of need a reference back to the specific chapters and specific topics that we've talked about. I'll make an announcement listing out what we've covered today and where to find it in the textbook as well. Okay. Any questions about what to expect for this week then? All good. Okay. So if there's no questions then, let me close this and head over to my AutoCAD. So like I mentioned, we're going to cover a few tools that are going to be required for us to complete assignment 3. And starting that out, we're going to talk about the measuring tool. So starting out here, I've kind of alluded to the measuring tool in the past when we talk about some of the assignments or maybe some of the practice problems. But the measuring tool is going to help us measure specific things that we've drawn to kind of verify that they are the correct length. Or if we pull up a drawing, an existing drawing, we can check the lengths on things to make sure we know how those dimensions are working, maybe specific angles as well. We can also do things like the area of a closed shape, that kind of idea. But just to kind of verify a lot of our drawings to make sure they're the right dimensions before we do anything weird to them. So the measuring tool itself, if you're following along by the textbook, measuring is in chapter 9.2. So chapter 9.2 is using the measuring tool. With the measuring tool itself, we can find it in the utilities panel of our ribbon. So far away from where our draw and modify was, all the way on the right side here, under utilities, we have our measure tool. With the measure tool, we have a few different options. Measure tool itself having a little down arrow beside its name. Again, whenever we see the down arrow, we have more options. So just quickly looking through this list, we have a few different ways we can measure or specific things we can measure with the tool. We have quick, distance for specific lengths, radius for circles or arcs, we can check the radius on them, angles, areas, and volumes. We won't be talking about volume because volume is 3D. This course is limited to 2D. We won't really need 3D for anything, anything at our kind of scope. But we'll be talking about all of the other ones in this list. We're going to leave quick to last because it's kind of like a summary of the rest of the tools. So starting off with distance, this is going to allow us to check lengths. So if I draw something like a rectangle, this doesn't have to be anything specific because I'm going to check the measurements anyways. Also draw just a straight line. So perhaps I get a drawing, it has some existing objects on it, and I want to check the length. Or maybe I've drawn these objects myself and I just want to verify that they are the correct length. Then from the measure tool here, we can select distance. And distance is going to ask me for 2 points, and then it's going to calculate the distance between those 2 points. So something to kind of keep in mind when using the measurement tool is to very often use object snap. The reason being, I want something like the endpoint snap in this case to allow me to snap to the exact endpoints of this line segment. If I choose not to use object snap, then I'm kind of forced to measure by eyeballing where my crosshair is placed along this line. So generally speaking, most measurement is done with object snap. So I can make sure that the crosshair is pinned to the exact point that I need to measure from. So along this line here, I'm going to use an endpoint and an endpoint snap here. So starting with the first point on the first side of the line, second endpoint on the other side of the line. It gives me a little bit of a preview here about that length, saying 12.3793. And when I click, it gives me a little menu here, and it re-verifies on my dynamic input that that length is 12.3793. Okay, this menu here is just going to allow me to change between the different measurement methods. I can just hit escape or the exit on the menu itself, and that will exit me back out of the measurement tool. So again, I can choose any 2 points. I can choose 2 points on this rectangle here. It'll give me the length between those 2 corners. I could choose the 2 opposite corners of this rectangle. And this one gives me a few different measurements here in this case. It's giving me the length across that rectangle, and it's also giving me the length and height of the rectangle, as well as an angle for the line I measured itself. So in the case of polylines, it can kind of give you some more info. But we're mostly kind of concerned with lengths in this case. So again, this is just to verify specific lengths by using the measurement tool. With the distance measurement as well, once I've selected the first point of my measurement, I also have a down arrow menu with just one option here for multiple points. What multiple points is going to allow me to do is rather than checking one length, I can now pick multiple points and it'll calculate the length between all of those points as I pick them. So if I pick something like the 4 corners of this rectangle going around clockwise or counterclockwise, it should be able to tell me the perimeter of this rectangle, so the distance around the edges. So choosing multiple points here, I can click around the edges using the endpoint snaps, and then when I finish here and hit enter, now it's telling me the distance 44.5638, and that was the distance across the entire perimeter because I chose all 4 corners in a row around that rectangle. This, of course, can work with things like zigzags, if I do some sort of zigzag shape here, or any line segments, anything you can snap to, really. Oh, let me make sure I choose multiple. And just clicking along this, it's tallying up or adding up all of those lengths as I go across. And then when I hit enter, it gives me that final value. So distance across all 4 of these line segments totaled to 22.68, so on, so on. Okay. So that's more or less distance. We also have radius in this list, just going down the list here. So if I make something like a circle, or if I have something like an arc in here, I'm just going to make kind of a basic arc. I can then check what the radius of that arc is, or the radius of the circle, using the radius tool here. It's going to ask me right away to select an arc or a circle so it can check the radius. So just choosing something like a circle here, it'll tell me the radius and diameter of that circle. Or I can use it on something like an arc, and it'll let me know what the radius or diameter of that arc is as well. If you imagine this arc as a completed circle, that's basically the radius it's telling you. Okay. It's pretty straightforward. It's just going to check radius of an arc or a circle and just let you know what that is. Moving on to angle. So this is going to measure any angle between 2 points. If I draw 2 lines that just intersect at a corner here, I can use the angle measurement. It's going to ask me to select lines or circles or anything that has an arc to it to check what that angle is. So if I choose 2 lines here, it'll give me an angle between those 2 lines. So this one between these 2 lines I've drawn here is 49 degrees. In the case of your assignment 2, if you wanted to verify something like that, you had kind of 2 circles, maybe at some sort of, I didn't do this particularly exactly. I could make it a bit more exact here. It's a bit too big. So you had something like this, 2 circles about 45 degrees away from each other. In the case of measuring these 2 circles, I have to be a little bit more creative. Wherever I click on this circle is going to be my first point. So if I click kind of close to this east quadrant of this circle, it's going to select that circle as the first point of that angle, but it's also choosing not just the circle that I'm making the angle off of, but exactly where I clicked on that circle. So if I do the same thing and choose the west quadrant, it's now starting from where I clicked. So I have to be a bit more specific with this one. What I can do is I could force it by doing my snap override, something like a quadrant. So I can snap to that quadrant, go up to my center point of that circle to verify that it's 45 degrees. Or we can set it by selecting my angle first, my angle measurement. I can hit enter and it'll ask me for a vertex. So this is the corner of the angle itself. If you think about an angle as a center point versus 2 kind of arc arms, this is the center point of that circle. And I'll kind of show what that means. So I can hit enter first. It'll ask for the angle vertex. If I choose the angle vertex to be the center point of this left circle, it'll now ask me for the first angle endpoint and then the second angle endpoint. So these are the 2 arms of the angle itself. So if I set one to be 0 degrees here, I can use the quadrant, or I can specify it to be 1. Did I use a comma there? I'm not sure. I can set this to like 1. It cooperates a bit here. 1 tab 0, there we go. And it'll give me a horizontal line here. And I know that line's 0 degrees because I specified it exactly. And then using the second arm here, I can go up to that center point again. And where I specified the vertex is exactly where these 2 angle arms is meeting. So I specified the vertex in this case to be the center point. So that's where these 2 kind of angle arms are meeting. Then I can specify my second arm to be the center point of the other circle. And now it's giving me that angle based on these two arms I've made. So the first one was 0 degrees. I manually specified that. And then I checked to this object snap of the second center point of the second circle. And that's also giving me that specific angle. So with circles, it's a little bit more tricky. Either I have to use something like object snaps in here, or I have to actually specify the vertex because the circle itself doesn't have many object snaps to work with. Unlike a line where I can pretty easily use endpoints or just select the two lines and it finds the angle between them, circles are a little bit more tricky. Okay. Finally, on here as well, we have area. So if I draw something like a rectangle and choose my area measurement, this is going to measure the area of any closed shape. So if I choose area, it's going to ask me or continually ask me to choose more corner points, and then I'll fill in those corner points with the area of the shape. So with something like a rectangle, I can start by using the first endpoint of this rectangle. It's going to keep asking for next point. So I can keep going around here, around the corners. And you can see when I get to the third point, it's starting to make a filled area that's going to calculate. So with the third point here, and then finally, the last corner, the fourth point. Now I'm done selecting corners of this rectangle, so I can just hit enter. And it'll tell me both the area of that rectangle as well as the perimeter of that rectangle. Okay. So this will tell me areas. I can do this with more complicated shapes. If I just make some bizarre multi-corner shape here, I can do the same thing, just using the endpoints and working my way around here to each of those corners. And AutoCAD will fill out that space that I'm defining here. Okay, so I've selected all the corners of this shape. I can hit enter, and it'll calculate the area and the perimeter of that shape. Something to keep in mind here for the area measurement is that if you have some sort of closed shape like this, you want to make your way around the perimeter of that shape, either clockwise or counterclockwise. You don't want to go across the shape at any point, because if I start going across the shape, AutoCAD's going to start getting very confused about what this shape's supposed to look like. So I want to keep it in the same kind of order. If I start crossing over and over again, you see that the shape's kind of losing its form here. So if I have some sort of closed shape, I always want to go around it either clockwise around the shape here. And that'll give me my area. Going counterclockwise is effectively the same thing. Where I can make my way around. As long as I'm following the line as it's drawn and not kind of making any shortcuts across the shape, then you're generally fine making the area. And you get the visual indication too. The green filled area is the area that's being calculated. If you start doing it out of order, it's going to be pretty obvious that the green area isn't filling the shape that you're trying to measure. Okay. Any questions about the measurement tools so far? I know I went through them a little bit quickly, but again, they're just to kind of verify lengths of objects or angles or radius, anything like that.
Sir, how
Yep.
can we see the drop down of that area?
The drop down menu?
Yeah, the drop down on the area portion, like the one you do lately.
The one just on here?
Yeah,
I just
when you
made my
select
way.
the area, when you
Yep.
select
So
the area, there is a drop down here.
I selected the area here, and then I just hit
Yeah.
enter. So I'm done selecting points for this area. So I hit enter,
Okay.
the
I
enter key on
will,
my keyboard, and then it tells me the area, perimeter, and it gives me a little menu if I want to change my measurement tool.
okay.
Yeah. So after selecting
Okay.
all your points, you just have to hit enter to get to the next step of the command.
Hey Brent, is there a different way to do area of a circle?
Okay, I got
Area of
it.
a circle. Let me double check. Can I actually? Yes, just had to double check. But if you do area, the down arrow menu gives you an object option. So I just went to measure and then area, and it's asking me for a first corner point. Obviously, a circle doesn't have corners. So if I hit my down arrow on my keyboard, it should give me my extra options here. And the object one in particular will be helpful for circles. So I can choose object and then select the circle being an object itself, and it'll fill in that circle area and give me the area and circumference.
Okay, awesome. Got it. Thanks.
Yeah. Good question, though, yeah. Because there's no corners on a circle, obviously.
Hey, Brent, I must have been sleeping. Did we use the quick measure or did we just start off at distance?
I skipped it for now. Quick
Okay.
kind of talks about all the measurements. So I wanted to go through them individually first, and then we'll talk about quick.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, you didn't fall asleep or anything.
Good.
So any other questions before I get carried away here? Okay. So to kind of summarize them, of course, we covered distance, radius, angle, area. Quick is going to be a method to, as it states, quickly check measurements of objects. So quick is going to be for all but area. It's going to help us get distances, radius, angles of things very rapidly. So if I draw something like a rectangle here, and I'll draw a circle beside it, and I'll draw a line, a couple lines. So I have a few different shapes here, a few different objects. Going into my menu here and switching it to quick will give me this kind of big orange crosshair that extends all the way outwards to my drawing area. And quick is going to give me angles, distances, radius, all at the same time, based on where my cursor position is. So if I get close to this line here, you can see it highlights and it tells me that length. If I get closer to the other line here, it's giving me another length. If I go between those two lines, it's giving me an angle. And it's giving me the complementary one. If I zoom in a little, it gives me the actual angle there, 151 degrees. I was a bit zoomed out, so it's giving me the complementary one above here. So the thing with quick is it's trying to make assumptions about what you're trying to measure, because I haven't specified any specific endpoints. I haven't specified any specific objects or anything like that. So it's trying to assume what I'm trying to measure at. And that's kind of again, back to the common idiom there. There's no such thing as a free lunch. So using quick, obviously it's much quicker. It's a lot faster to get those measurements. But since it's quicker, AutoCAD has to make assumptions about what you're specifically trying to measure. So it's not always perfect. So again, like when I zoomed out here, is giving me the above angle if this line extended outwards to the up to the left. And that's not necessarily the angle I was looking for. So I had to zoom in a little bit more here. And it might properly give me, or scroll down maybe, and then it gives me the proper angle that I was looking for. Same with circles. If I get near a circle or an arc, it's going to quickly tell me what the radius is of that circle or arc. Rectangles as well. It's giving me a length and a height to that rectangle. And something really handy that comes with the quick tool is that when I try to measure angles with the quick tool, and it's a 90-degree angle exactly, it's going to throw a little orange square into the corner. So in this rectangle, I have orange squares, the right angle kind of symbol in each of the corners. And that's a rapid way that quick is letting me know that that's an exactly 90-degree angle. So if I draw let me turn off polar tracking here. So I'm going to eyeball two 90 or a 90-degree and a 0-degree line to make a right angle. Let me just make sure everything's off here. So I eyeballed this. It looks pretty close to a 90-degree angle. But when I use my quick measurement and I get close to it, I can make this a bit more egregious here. So now that I've used quick here, I've really eyeballed this 90-degree angle. Now, the angle for quick here is telling me it's 90 degrees, but that added verification of that orange square in the corner is directly telling me that it's exactly 90 degrees. So in this case, where it says 90 degrees and it gives me an angle, there's actually floating decimals there. Compared to when I go back to my rectangle here, obviously the rectangle tool is going to make perfect 90-degree angles. So it's giving me these orange boxes in the corners. Whereas I come back over here to these two lines I just drew, it's saying it's 90 degrees, but I know it's not exactly 90 degrees because there's no orange box. Okay, so that's like an extra helpful thing with quick as well. It can verify 90-degree angles pretty well. Last thing to mention here with measurement is that the precision of the measurement itself is based on your drawing unit's measurement precision. So like I was kind of talking about with assignment 2, the assignment 2 drawing file itself was a little tricky because it wasn't showing decimals. If you use the measurement tools on that drawing, and I use something like quick, if I throw this off just a little bit here, and go to measure it, my measuring tools are only as good as my drawing precision settings. So it's still telling me 10. I've purposely changed the radius of the circle to 10.1, but it's still telling me 10 because the drawing units on this drawing are still set to not show decimals. So I have to go back into my application menu here, go to drawing utilities, change the units, turn up the precision here, how many decimals you need, hit OK. And then when I go back with my quick tool, now it's properly showing me 10.1. So your drawing measurement tools are only as precise as the drawing units settings are. They're not going to be perfect right off the bat. So you do have to go back to drawing utilities, units, and set up the proper precision. Same with angles as well. It will not show decimals unless it's properly set to show decimals in your drawing units. Okay, so it's really handy for getting precise measurements, but it has to be set up correctly as well. Okay. Any questions about quick measurement or anything with the measurement tool before we move on? Okay. So from measurement, we're going to move on to our kind of more advanced editing tools here. So if you're following along with the textbook again, we're going to jump again. Measure was in chapter 9.2. We're going to jump over to chapter 11. So in chapter 11, we're going to go through 11.1, which is all about the trim tool, 11.4, which is offset, and array, which is 11.5. Okay. So starting with chapter 11.1 is the trim tool. So if I draw something like a rectangle here, our trim tool is going to be another way that we can remove line segments from our drawing. So if you kind of recall back all the way back to week 1-ish, 1 or 2, we talked a little bit about the erase tool. So again, erase was under our modify panel, and this was to get rid of objects that we might have accidentally drawn, or if we're making changes to a drawing and we need to get rid of something, there's an amendment to that drawing or something like that, we need to remove it. Trim is going to do kind of the same thing, in a way. There are some differences. But trim, when I select it, again, it's just the kind of scissor tool. It looks like a pair of scissors on my modify panel. Trim is also going to allow me to remove line segments or objects from a drawing. So when I select trim, it's going to ask me to select objects to trim off or delete from my drawing. If I hover over any lines, it grays them out and gives me the little red X. Just like if I chose erase and hovered over something, it makes it grayed out and a little red X to show that that object or that line is being deleted. Okay. So I can then go around, I can left click on objects to delete them. Or if I redraw my rectangle here, I can also click and drag my mouse to cut multiple things or trim multiple things at a time. So if I click and drag, I now get this kind of drawing tool, like a pencil tool almost. And if I cross this pencil tool through any lines, they'll be grayed out, indicating that they're going to be deleted. Okay. And then as soon as I let go of my mouse, my left mouse button, then those lines disappear. Okay. So you might have noticed right away, but what's the difference then between trim and erase? They're both removing lines or removing shapes from my drawing. What's the difference between trim and erase? Don't they do the same thing? Anyone know?
I think erase the whole rectangle, but trim can erase parts of the rectangle like lines or sides. That's what I noticed.
Yep, exactly. So more specifically, you're absolutely correct, but a bit more specifically is that erase is working on an object basis. So it's looking for specific objects to erase, whereas trim is actually looking for intersections between lines and then or between endpoints or coordinates, and then removing the line between those coordinates. So what I kind of, to demonstrate what that actually means, is if I have a rectangle, I'm going to draw two pretty much identical rectangles here. Both of them are polylines. Since they're polylines, they're considered one object. With the erase tool, since it works on an object basis, it's going to remove the entire rectangle because the rectangle is one object. So you can see the entire rectangle grays out. If I hit enter, that entire rectangle disappears. Now what trim is doing is that when I highlight a line or hover over it, it's only graying out the line that I have my cursor hovered over. So what it's doing in terms of kind of the coding end of things of how AutoCAD works is that it's detecting this endpoint on the left. It's detecting that coordinate or that endpoint. It's also detecting the endpoint on the other side at the top right. And then it's removing the line segment between those two coordinates. And this works for any intersection. So if I choose this, something like this line here, there's an intersection between this line segment and the one on the left, and there's an intersection between this top line and the one on the right. So it's going to remove the line segment between those two lines. Okay, and I can drag through multiple, cut multiple away at the same time. And this works for all intersections. So what that kind of means is that if I then have a line that passes through this rectangle, something like this, then my trim tool is again going to look for the nearest intersections. So if I try to erase this right line here, or trim it off rather, it's now looking for the nearest intersections where the nearest intersection up is this connection to the diagonal line, and the nearest intersection downwards is the corner of the rectangle. So if I do another line through here, again, it's looking for the nearest intersections. So it's not going to go down to the corner. It's just checking for the two nearest intersections again between the two diagonal lines here. Okay. So I can trim that out. And now I have this kind of gap going through this rectangle. So it's looking for the two nearest intersections. This also works with circles. If I put a circle over this as well, let's make it kind of like this. And I go to trim. It's also going to look for that arc of that circle, and it's going to trim between the two intersections between the circle and the rectangle, and the circle and this first diagonal line. Okay. So it's looking for two intersection points and then removing the line or arc between them. So this can be kind of handy if you have things overlaying each other, especially in the case of circles, happens pretty often. Like if I want to, for example, let me grab my geometric center snap. And I want to do this, I suppose. Let's get midpoint back in here. Something like this. And if I want this rectangle now to have a rounded edge on one side and then leave the other side rectangular, I can then go to my trim tool. Remember, the circle's one object, the rectangle's one object, so I wouldn't be able to do this with erase. But with trim, I can get rid of this left side here, get rid of that rectangle, and I can remove this inner arc. And now I have this kind of rounded rectangle shape where it's rounded on one side. Okay, so that's kind of like a general application. It happens pretty often with circles. Trim's pretty commonly used with circles because you draw the circles to start out and then it's connected to something else and you kind of need to remove a portion of that circle to make it one solid object, or one solid shape rather. So it happens pretty often. Trim's very handy. I'd say it's more handy than erase most of the time, but there are still use cases for erase. Say if I have a line that crosses through this object now, and I want to remove this entire line, now trim becomes kind of less convenient because I have to trim out this, I have to trim out the top here, I have to trim out the bottom. Whereas using erase or the more default mode, just selecting it and hitting delete, same thing, that will remove the whole line. Okay, so they do both have their use cases. It's just I find trim is a bit more common, but they both do have their purpose. Okay. Any questions about trimming at all? That's pretty much the gist of it. Attached to trim is also extend, but we'll talk about that later. Any questions at all? All good? How are we doing on time here? Okay. Okay. If there's no questions right away, we'll take our 10-minute break now, and then we'll reconvene at 7:04 and continue on. So I'll give you 10 minutes, 7:04, we'll continue on with the last couple tools, and then we'll talk about the assignment as well. Okay. All right, folks, 7:04, so let's continue on. So, just 3 more tools that we need to cover here. I'm going to share my screen again. Going back to AutoCAD. So, jumping again down the textbook here, we were just in chapter 11.1 for trim. We'll move on to 11.4 for offset. So the offset tool is going to be another modify tool that we have. And this one's going to allow us to draw lines or duplicate lines a certain distance away from some sort of existing line. So there's going to be an offset line parallel to a line that we previously created. It's a bit of a vague description, but I'll kind of show you what that means, and that'll be a bit more obvious. So I'm going to draw a rectangle here, and I'm also going to draw a right angle with a couple lines, just to demonstrate. So our offset tool, again, in the modify panel, up on our ribbon, we have offset. It's the one in the bottom right. Kind of looks like a racetrack almost. So offset, when we select offset, it's first going to ask us for an offset distance. This is how far away from the pre-existing lines do we want the new created lines. So in this case, just for demonstration, I'm going to put in a distance of 2. And now it's going to ask me for objects to offset from. We have a couple examples here. We have a rectangle being a polyline, and I've drawn this right angle here just with the line tool. So these are 2 separate objects here. Okay. So I've specified my distance, my offset distance. How far away from the original line do I want to go? Now I need to specify what objects specifically am I offsetting. So starting with the rectangle here, I can select the rectangle just by left-clicking on it. And you can see here, we're creating offset lines from the original pre-existing line. So in the case of the rectangle, since it's a polyline, it's one enclosed object, I can make a fully enclosed rectangle 2 units away from the original lines. So these side lines here are 2 units away from the original. Same on the other side. This new line is 2 units away in distance from the original line that's highlighted blue. Same with the top and bottom. The side of the original object that I'm offsetting is dependent on my cursor position. So if I'm trying to make a bigger rectangle than the original, I want my cursor on the outside, and it'll offset outside of the rectangle for a larger rectangle. Or I can put my cursor on the inside of that rectangle, and it's going to offset to the inside, making a smaller rectangle. Okay. So once I've selected my object, decided which side I want to offset to, then I just have to click, and that offset is created. So now I have my original rectangle here that I've selected, and now I have a new offset rectangle inside of it, each one of these lines being a distance of 2 units away. Okay, so 2 units to the left and right, 2 units up and down. And that's what our offset distance kind of means there. I specified it as 2 units of offset distance, so the offset lines are 2 units away. Similarly, I can use offset for lines. Of course, this is on an object basis. So if I do the same thing, specify offset distance of 2, hit enter, select a line to offset, and I choose which side of that line to pick. So I can offset on the inside or the outside, and that will create an offset line as well. Okay, but since this is on an object basis, since I've just selected the one line, it's only offsetting that one line. Now, if I selected both lines here, both the vertical and the horizontal, or if I properly select them here, or I might not be able to here. Yeah, so with offset, you're only able to select one line. So I can only, in this case, I can't offset both and make a proper corner. I can only offset one of these lines at a time here. So I can offset outside and I can offset this one outside, but I don't get the corner, that corner to be filled because this isn't one object in this case. This is two separate lines, okay? So if I were to make this a full rectangular shape here, this offset's going to be a bit messier because this isn't one solid rectangular object. I'm missing these kind of corners. They're all gapped there. Okay. If I do it on the inside as well, then I get these kind of rough corners here where the line extends all the way to the edge, unlike the polyline version where it's already kind of been trimmed out there. Okay. So there's a bit of a difference when you're using a polyline to offset versus just individual lines. Just something to kind of watch out for. With offset as well, as I go through these options, I set the offset distance. I select the objects that I want to offset. And then I make my selection. I'm still within the offset command, so I can continue to select lines and keep offsetting them until I hit either enter or escape to exit out of that command. So AutoCAD is going to keep prompting me to keep doing offsets until I leave that command as well. Okay. So similar to like when we're like doing copy or line segments, it's going to keep recursively asking for more offsets until you exit out. On the other hand, though, if we do offset, set the distance, choose the object here, I can use my down arrow menu to go to the option for multiple lines. And this will allow me to do multiple offsets kind of in one go without having to go back and select the line, make an offset, select another line, make the offset, go back and forth. This lets me kind of rapidly do a bunch of offsets at once. And just like with line segments or with copy, there's also a down arrow option in here for undo. So I can undo the most recently done offset. There's also an option here to exit out of the command. Okay. I can also type U, just like line or copy. I can type U to undo those offsets as well. Okay. With offset as well, with the specification there of the offset distance, if I go back, I'm just going to remove all these offsets I drew earlier. With the distance, it says specify offset distance or another down arrow menu. From here, we have another option for through. It's just showing my previous what I've input 2.0, but we also have through in here. If I choose through, it's going to ask me for an object to offset, and then I can manually determine the distance, or I can type in the offset distance. So it's not forced to whatever the input was. I now have a bit more free reign on how to set this offset. And this can be handy if I'm looking for something like a midpoint snap, or if it's supposed to snap to some other object. Maybe there's a circle in here and I want to offset it to kind of border this circle. I can set an offset with the through command. Maybe I don't know the exact length away this circle is, so I can use something like the quadrant snap to bring those sides in, something like that. A bunch of general kind of uses, right? Similar to other commands or other tools, you can specify the exact coordinates to set where the center point of a circle is, for example, or you can use something like object snaps to set the center point. Same idea with offset. You can manually input the offset distance, or you can kind of use the through option to use object snaps. Okay. So offset's going to allow us to draw these lines. This is going to come in handy with our assignment 3 as well. Any questions for offset at all? All good. Okay. And you can imagine that offset's pretty handy for things like if you need to make a border around something, it's pretty helpful for that. If you need to make guidelines for some things, or you're making a grid, perhaps, it can be helpful for those as well. Moving on, though, our last kind of command for now is, or our last editing tool rather, is array. So array is going to be a tool that we can use to set some sort of object into a specified amount of rows and columns. So if you think about, if I have one object, I can then expand it out into kind of a grid of those objects. To kind of demonstrate that, I'm going to make a circle here. Doesn't really matter how this circle is placed or anything like that. I just have a standard circle. Our array command, again, is in the modify panel. It's this kind of group of squares here for rectangular array. And again, array is going to allow us to make copies of that object in a set combination of rows and columns. With rectangular array, there's a little menu here. We can change it to path array or polar array as well. We'll talk about those much further down the line, I think around week 7 or week 8, but we're mostly just focused with rectangular for now. So with rectangular array, it's going to, just like most editing commands or modify commands, ask me to select objects to then create an array out of. I'll choose this circle I drew earlier, and to move on with the command to proceed to the next step, I can just hit enter. And it's going to make a defaulted array of that circle. So it's set that circle into a bunch of copies. There's rows rather, of circles, and there's also columns of those circles that I selected. You'll also notice right away that not only do we have a bunch of circles on here, we now have some new grip points to work with, and my ribbon has changed. So the ribbon at the top of my screen now has a new tab called Array Creation. And this is going to be a bunch of tools for actually specifying how this array should be designed. So starting with the ribbon here, we have a section here, a panel for columns. So how many vertical columns of circles do we have? It's defaulted it to 4 columns of circles. So you can see there's 4 columns. We also have settings for how far between each of these circles, how much distance between each circle, and the actual total of distance from the very first circle to the very last circle. In terms of distance, when it talks about between and total, this is based on wherever the base point of that object is. In the case of a circle, it's defaulted the base point, this kind of square in the bottom left here of the original copy, is based on the center point of the circle. So when it talks about between, this between distance here, if I set that to something like 15, just to make it a bit cleaner, there's 15 units of distance from this center point of the first circle to the center point of the second circle. And you can see there on my dynamic input, it's telling me 15 units of distance from center point to center point. Okay. Therefore, if there's 4 columns, there's 15 units between each gap here, center point to center point. We have 1, 2, 3 gaps. 3 times 15 should be 45. And just like it says up here, the total should be 45 units from the center point of the first circle to the center point of the last circle of columns. Okay, so it's 15 units here, 15 units here, and then 15 units here for 45 in total. So there's a reason we might choose to specify the between distance or the total distance. Maybe I need to set a specific amount of columns across a certain distance. I need to fit it within a certain distance, but I don't know I don't want to manually divide out how many columns versus how much distance I have, so I might use a total for that. If I do know specifically how far apart these should be placed, maybe it's like the lighting on the ceiling of some sort of public building, and I know that the lights are separated every 20 meters out or something like that, 10 meters out, then I can specify there should be 10 units between each circle, and I can set it that way. Or conversely, if I know there should be 10 rows of lights, but the total distance across the building is something like 200 meters, then I can set the total to 200 and it'll automatically divide out what that distance between each column should be. Okay. So it's based on what information you're basically given or specified in a blueprint. The difference between and total here just depends on what information you're given. And of course, I can change the number of columns. I can set it to 2 columns. So now there's only 2 columns of circles. I can do just 1 line, 1 column of circles, etc., etc. As a bit of a quick reference to the grip points on an array as well, let me set it back to 2 so I can see, or actually set it to 3 so I can see all of them. Our bottom left one from our original circle that I made the array from, this one is going to be my defaulted to move command. So this grip points for moving the array around. The first grip point, either for the columns or the rows, the first arrow there is for the distance between each row or column. So I can change the distance based on the grip here for spacing. And the final grip is how many rows or columns. So I can change the row or column count by using the third grip point here. Okay. Same thing works for the columns here. I can change the spacing for the columns. And I can change the amount of columns. Okay. We also have this one in the top right. And this is going to remove or add both rows and columns. So the square on the opposite corner in the top right, this will change both the count of rows and columns at the same time. So it's just a peek into the grips. If you choose to use the grips, if you prefer using grips, that's a method to use them. Otherwise, you can just use the ribbon. They functionally do the same thing. Okay. Oops. Let me go back. My array here. So column panel, next panel is obviously for rows. So how many rows do I have laid out on top of each other here? I can set it to 1 row, and now I just have the circles laid out horizontally. I've accidentally exited out of my array again. Okay, so I can change the number of rows here. Same idea, I get the between and I get the total. I can change those variables as well. When it comes to the panel about levels, we're not concerned about levels currently. It's more pertinent for 3D effects, but not highly relevant for us. So we're going to ignore levels for now. The last important tools on here as well is we have associative and we have base point. So as we've kind of talked about with a bunch of editing tools before, we can change the base point on this array. So I can change where that set of grip points is and where that array is moved from, or where these grips are kind of located on the array. Okay, so we can change the base point of the array itself. And where that comes more into play is where this associative button comes in. So what we mean by an associative array is whether or not those circles are considered one kind of collective object, or when I create the array, are each of the circles their own kind of independent object. So if I leave it as associative, and I'll switch the base point back to normal here, if it's associative and I go to close the array to finish my command here, I can either click the button here or I can just hit escape. I'll close my array. if this array is associative, now it's one kind of grouped object of circles. So when I move one, I move them all. Whereas if I do the same thing, I go back here and make my array, and it's not an associative array, and I close it, finish the command, now each of these circles is its own independent object. They're not grouped together. Okay. So this can be kind of important. If you have an array and you don't really care about editing the individual moving parts, you can just leave it as one associative object and move that entire array around together. But in some cases, you may want to array out a bunch of objects and then individually edit them. If you're constantly working with circles and you're doing a bunch of circles and then each one of them has a different symbol on the inside, maybe you're drawing something like WMIS symbols or PPE symbols or something like that. You might want to array out the circles and then draw within those circles something else. You might want it non-associative. So that's going to control whether these circles are both or all grouped together, or if they're their own individual objects that can be then individually manipulated. Okay. And am I missing anything here? No, I think that's about it. Any questions about rectangular array at all? Again, we're just making copies in rows and columns, and then determining whether those new objects are their own thing or if they're all grouped together. Okay.
Once you make it an associative array and you click like close array or whatever, is there any way to unassociate it?
Yes. So if I do make an associative array, I can make a circle here and then array it out. If I do make it associative and I close this array, I can then reselect the array and type in the command explode. And explode will break it back up into individual objects.
Got it. Excellent.
Yeah. We'll talk more about explode further down the line, but explode is going to generally take some sort of polyline or a bunch of grouped objects and break them back up into their individual components. So again, I can array it, make it associative, close the array. I now have an associative array, and then I type explode, EXPLODE, and then hitting enter, it breaks them back up. Okay. Joining them back into one array again is a bit more complicated though. So generally making it associative and then exploding it is a bit safer. If you make it non-associative, it's harder to make it associative again, kind of further down the line. Any other questions at all about arrays? How are we doing on time here? Okay. Okay, if there's no questions, we'll move on to our last section here on annotation. So I'm going to remove all these circles here, and I'm going to draw a rectangle. So last section we have to talk about for assignment 3 here is annotation. And when we talk about annotation in general, this is generally kind of text related things. So either just straight up lettering, dimensions fall under annotation, leaders, things like that. If we have dimensions and we need to type numbers in, generally falls under annotation. So in order to do annotation or to draw text, we have on the home tab of our ribbon, we have a little section here for annotation, an annotation panel. So this is for some quick annotation tools. These are helpful just being on the home page here or the home tab to kind of quickly get at. But if you want more settings and a bit more out of your annotation, there is a separate tab for annotate. So we're originally on the home tab with all our regular tools that we've been using. I can switch it to the annotate tab, and now we have more specific and more advanced tools for annotation. Okay. So for the time being, I'm going to use the Home tab for annotation. We're not going to go into anything crazy detailed, but I'll dip a little bit into the Annotate tab as well for some additional options. Okay. So what we're most concerned about with Annotate is actually forming text itself. Our first assignment here, or our first kind of more electrical specific assignment here, Assignment 1 and Assignment 2 are kind of arbitrary shapes. Assignment 2 is a bit more of a machined plate with some gaskets in it. But Assignment 3 is going to be more geared towards electrical specifically. We're going to be drawing a symbol legend. So electrical symbols, and we're going to have to describe in text what those symbols mean. So we're going to have to describe them, of course, using text. In order to make annotation or make text, we need the text button from the annotation panel. So the text button here also has a little down arrow for two different options. We'll talk about them both. We have multi-line text and single-line text. They are as they describe. Multi-line text is for making multiple lines of text that are kind of strapped together as one object. Whereas single line text is if I just need to make one line of text, I'm not writing out a paragraph or anything like that. So starting out with multi-line text itself, if I select multi-line text, it's going to ask me to specify two corners that this text is going to fit in. So it wants a rectangular area, and then the text is going to fit in that rectangle. So I'll specify the two corners of this drawn rectangle here, just as demonstration. So I've chosen the top left corner. I can choose the bottom right corner. And before I click here, there's even a little indicator there on the rectangle that I'm drawing here. That down arrow that's pointing, that's showing me the direction of the text as well. So it's going to draw text left to right and then down that rectangle. So I'll specify the opposite corner here, the opposite corner of the rectangle. And now again, my ribbon changes, similar to when we were arraying. Now we have this new text editor tab. And I can see there's like a bit of a justification bar or a ruler here for my text and a little blank space to start typing in my text. So I'm going to zoom in just a little bit on it here. Let's go right there. So right away, I can start typing text. So I can type anything that I want in here, just using my keyboard. And as I keep, I'm going to copy and paste in this case, just for demonstration. As I keep adding more text here, as it showed with the down arrow, it's going to keep going downwards through that text, and it's going to try its best to fit in that rectangular area that I specified. So I've gotten to the bottom of that rectangular area. If I keep adding text, it's going to start spilling out. But it's trying its absolute best to keep it in the square area that I've specified. If I go back up here and make it not make new lines on me, you can see as I kind of get to the edge here, it's kind of spilling out a little bit until I hit enter to start the new line. So it's kind of similar to using something like what Microsoft Word, except in a drawing space, you're not confined to the paper, the sheet of paper like Word is. It's going to keep kind of expanding infinitely any direction. So what I have to do instead is kind of grab this ruler here and shrink down my width. This ruler, if you've kind of worked with Word, if I go, can I go to my Microsoft Word here just as an example? I'll get my ruler here. But with Microsoft Word, basically that ruler that's working on AutoCAD is the same as the page limits with the margins in Word. So this is like the far left of that ruler bar and the far right. including like the 1/4 inch or so of margin, or 1/2 inch or so. So similarly, I have to pull in this ruler to fit that text to that square so it's not spilling out on me. It will still expand out downwards and spill out the bottom, but I've at least kind of limited it to the right boundary of this rectangle. So if I keep typing in here, now it's going to skip to the next line for me. Okay. So just something to keep in mind. It's not highly relevant all the time, but it's good to use as kind of a boundary here to limit how far my text goes. Okay. So I can type in whatever text I need in here. And then when I'm done typing in my text, I can hit Close Text Editor, or I can just left click. Oops, I clicked on the thing there. I can left click off as well, off of the actual text bar, and I'll finish and complete it. My box is huge, so my text looks small here. And then that's where my text lands. So with the actual text size, so if you kind of look back to when we're in Word here, we have a certain text font. We have text size here as well, font size. In AutoCAD, it's a little bit more sketchy or complicated. When we're drawing text here, I can specify my area that I'm going to place text. But before specifying the opposite corner, we can have an option for height. So pressing my down arrow menu here, before I've specified the opposite corner, we have an option for height in here. And from here, I can type in what the font size of this text should be. So I can put in 2.5 point text size. And then when I go to finish making my box here, then I can type in my text and it'll be size 2.5 font. Okay. So again, using multi-line text, specify the first corner, down arrow to height. Then I can type in whatever height. This left-clicking selection is a bit arbitrary. It doesn't really work all that well. It's better to type in what font size you need. So I can type in something like 10. And then specify the opposite corner. And then when I go to type, it should be that font size. Okay. If I ever draw text and I then need to go back and edit it, so if I made a typo or something, I can double click on any existing text. So double left click, clicking left click twice rapidly will open up the text editor again, and then I can make my edits in here and then exit out again. So I'm just double clicking on the text and then it gives you the editor. Okay. Last thing to mention here with multi-line text as well is that after selecting my boundary box here for my text, we have this section for justification. So up here in the paragraph panel of my text editor tab, we have a button for justification. And this is kind of similar to, when we go back on Word here, again, similarly, paragraph panel in Word, this is changing where my text is placed along that sheet, right? So if I have it left bound or aligned to the left of the page, it starts the text from the left. I can center it. You might be familiar with this, writing project essays or whatever. And this will control where my text kind of starts from and where it expands from on the page. Similarly with AutoCAD, we have justification here. So I have it set currently by default to top left. So it's going to start in the top left of this box and make its way across and then down. Since AutoCAD is 2D, and it's not just writing on a piece of paper, we can justify it in a lot of different ways. So I can do top center, and this is very similar to when I go back on Word here and align to center. My text sits in the middle here. So same thing. My text expands from the center, top center of this box. We can put it to the right, so it starts from the right and expands left. But since it's a drawing space and it can kind of start wherever I want, I also have options like middle center. This will make sure my text is centered properly. So it's centered within the box. It's justified to both the middle and the center. We can put it to the middle right, middle left, bottom left of the box, bottom center, bottom right, anything like that. So if I'm kind of drawing text and I want it to be centered within this box, I can choose something like middle center, and then I know my text is perfectly centered within this box. I can then double click on it. If I'm writing something that's a bit more paragraph formed, I might choose something like top left, and now I've buggered it up a little bit. And now it's going to start from the top left and expand out. What justification controls as well is the base point of that text. So text as well, when we talk about like grips and object snaps, text doesn't have endpoints. It doesn't have center points. It doesn't have any of these object snaps that we're pretty comfortable with in here. What text uses is the insertion snap. So insertion snap will allow me to snap to that text, and that text, its base point is also associated with that insertion point, snap, or vice versa. So if I justify this to be top left, the base point of that text is going to be in the top left. So I grab it by its grab handle in the top left. I can also justify it to middle center. And then when I go back here, the grab handle or the base point is in the middle center of that text. And this is kind of important for when we go to align text. If we want text to be aligned with a symbol in our legend, we want the center of that symbol to be aligned with the center of the text. We don't want the text sitting slightly too high or slightly too low. Okay? And I'll show what I kind of mean by that when we go through the assignment a little bit here. Okay, so that's more or less our multi-line text. Again, you specify your boundary box. Before you make the second corner, you can change the height, the font size. So you can set it to whatever you want. Finish the box. You can type whatever text you want. You can adjust the ruler here to whatever the right end boundary is of that text. And then you can also justify it so it fits however you want it to in that box. Okay. Those are the main points. There's more details with multi-line text as well, but we're just covering the basics just to introduce you to it, and also so you're not overwhelmed, and also just to kind of prime you for assignment 3. Okay. Any questions with multi-line text so far? All good? So similarly as well, we have single line text. So if I go again from my text control here, we can change to single line text. And this is for one just kind of straight line of text. We are not making multiple paragraphs or anything like that. Like if I go back to Word here, I'm not making multiple lines of text here or anything like that. It's just for one straight line of text. Okay. So I can switch this from multi-line to single line text. And this is going to function more or less the same. It just has a slightly different setup and only works for a single line of text. You can't press enter and go to the next line or anything like that. So with single line text, when I select it, rather than asking for a boundary box, it's asking for where does that text start from. So it wants a start point, a start coordinate. So I can set this to something like 0, 0 to start from the origin. And then when I hit enter, my text begins. I move on to the next part of my command, which is to specify the height. So with multi-line text, I hit my down arrow and I can get to height. With single line text, it's kind of baked into the command. It's the second step. So here I can type in whatever font size I want. So I can put in size 5 font, hit enter. Moving on to the third step now. First was where do I want to start the text? Second was the height of the text. Now it's asking for a rotation angle. So if I want this text rotated in any angle, maybe I want it sitting vertically because I'm making a graph or something. Maybe I want it upside down for whatever reason. So for our kind of purposes, most of the time it's going to be 0 degrees of rotation, 0 degrees being perfectly horizontal and upright. If it was 180 degrees, it would be upside down, so on and so forth. So 0 degrees to start it out. And now I get to type my text. So unlike the multi-line text, I don't have that ribbon that pops up immediately. I'm just typing text. So from here, I can type in whatever text I need. If I press enter, I can kind of go to a next line here, but it works a lot less well than using multi-line text. So this is more for just kind of one straight line. If I write any text here and I'm done writing my text, same idea. I can left click away from the text. I can hit escape and I can exit out of that command. Okay. So something it didn't ask me for because I didn't have the ribbon was the justification. Justification still matters in single line text because remember it changes the position of the text itself, but also the base point. So by default here with this single line text, it's defaulted the base point to the bottom left. I have to go back in here and change that if I've already set the text, or during the process of making single line text here. Or I've already skipped it. It's my bad. I need to hit the down arrow before I start any text and go to justify. Okay. So before starting single line text, I have to justify, whereas multi-line text, it was up in the ribbon. So hitting justify here, I get the same options here. I can justify it left, center, right. Here's our abbreviations for a lot of them. Top left, TL, top center, top right, TR, ML, MC, MR for middle left, middle center, middle right, and then BL, BC, BR for bottom left, bottom center, bottom right. Okay. So I can set the justification in this case, for example, hint, hint to assignment 3 to ML for middle left. And then as I create this text here, going through those same options again, now I have a new piece of text here, or an annotation, where I have a base point now in the middle left of that text, where the default one just had the defaulted bottom left. Now I've gone through the justify settings, and now I have a middle left base point as well, or insertion point. Okay. Same thing if I want a center point, I can do single line text, down arrow to justify, go to middle center, hit enter. It wants me to specify a starting point, specify the font size, again, same first two steps, rotation angle for the third step, and then when I make my sample here of text, Now I have the defaulted bottom left grip, but I also have a base point or an insertion point at the middle center. And again, this is just, yeah.
Sorry, I missed how you changed kind of the grip or the insertion point on this single line text.
Sure. So again, with single line text, I'm just choosing single line. Before I specify the starting coordinate, I need to hit the down arrow, and I have an option for justify.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So justify, again, I can set it to top right for this example. It's asking for where I want to start this coordinate at. Specify the height, font size, rotation angle. Insert that text. And then I now have a top right insertion point. Okay.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. If you have created the text already and you need to justify it now, with single line text, when we double click on it and get into the editor, again, we don't have the editor tab at the top. So I don't have an editor tab, so I don't have that justify button. If I want to change the justification now, I actually have to enter a command because I don't have a button for it. So if I do tjust, T-J-U-S-T, T for text, just for justify, and hit enter, it's going to ask me to select some text, some objects. I'll select this text here, press enter to let it know I'm done with my selection here. And then I can change the justification. I get the same menu. I can choose middle left, and now my base point's moved to middle left. Same thing, tjust, change it to top right. Now I have a base point in the top right. Tjust, middle right, and then we have a middle right grip. Okay. So that's a bit of an intro into annotation. That's pretty much it for today. We've kind of run to the end of the class here. I'll introduce assignment 3 on Thursday, and we'll go through chapter 6's projects on Thursday as well. So that's pretty much it of the lecturing this week. Thursday is going to be mostly a work period, both for assignment 3 and for chapter 6 in the textbook. Okay. If you have any questions, you can stick around. Otherwise, we're pretty much at the end of the class today, so you're free to go. If you have any questions, just stick around. You can ask them as well, or you can shoot an email.
Are you game to answer questions in regards to the assignment, or would you rather just wait? Yeah? Okay, cool.
Yeah, I can. If you want to take a peek at assignment 3 early, by all means, so I can take questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, so the Universal Coordinate System, or the UCS symbol.
Yep.
I understand how to move it, but I don't quite understand what that's actually doing. What does that actually accomplish?
Yeah. So the UCS is the basis for the grid on AutoCAD. It determines where the 0, 0 point is, of course, of the grid. What the assignment's going to ask you to do is change the both the grid and the grid snap to properly space your text and symbols. So we have to change where the UCS is to align it to kind of the page size. So I'll share my screen here to kind of show what I mean by that. I have an example, a sample version here. So this is my legend here, and it's already properly spaced. But if I turn on my grid and show my UCS here, so I've moved the UCS here to be in line with the very first center point of the first symbol. And since my grid is set to be spaced out at 9 units horizontally and vertically, I know that there's 9 units between this point and the next point. So when I go into center snap and move these objects around, like if I didn't have these symbols here and I need to place them.
Yep.
Since I have grid set to 9 for the spacing and I have snap on, I can just take the next symbol, grab it by its center point here. Oh, I gotta turn off snap. Grab it by its center point, turn on my grid snap, and then just plop it along that grid. So I know now, since my grid spacing and I'm snap to grid, this spacing should be exactly to what I set it, and it should be perfectly in line.
Yep. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And then the other thing that I noticed was that the text is supposed to line up with what is it, 20 units to the right of that. But if our grid
Yes.
snap is on and set to 9 for horizontal and vertical, we'll never be able to hit that. So are we supposed to just kind of ignore the sequence that's presented to us in the assignment and maybe turn off our grid snap to get it in the right place in this
Yes.
particular instance? Okay.
That's kind of just a non-mentioned step, but yes, you will have to turn off grid snap in order to make that spacing 20, because obviously 20 isn't divisible by 9, like you said. So you're gonna have to turn off grid snap in order to make that spacing 20. The grid snap
Okay.
is just for making sure these symbols are all aligned and properly spaced.
Okay. That makes way more sense. Okay.
Yeah, no
I
problem.
was trying to too rigidly follow the rules because I thought there was an ultimate purpose to it. So yeah.
Fair
Okay.
enough, yeah. There
Thank
are
you.
some like kind of hidden steps that are more implied, but yeah. Yeah, good questions though.
And I think there was somebody who wrote a question in the chat there
Yes.
while we were chatting.
Yep, so there's a question about where assignment 3 is. I'll share my screen again here. Assignment 3 is in the week 5 folder. So I'm just here on Brightspace under the content section, week 5, the PDF and the associated drawing file that you need. Both are here in the week 5 folder. So assignment 3 is the instructions here. Looks like this for the instructions. And then you also have title block A4 is the drawing file that you're using as a basis. So I need to download that. And when I open it up, you should have something like this, a blank symbol legend to work with. Okay. So those are both in there. When you go to hand in, these are both in the week 5 folder. When you go to hand in, it's just in the usual spot, assessments, assignments, and then assignment 3 is in here as a new folder. Okay. Yep, no problem, Lawrence. Yeah, no problem, guys. See you next time.
Thank you, Brent. Have a good night.
Yeah, you too.
Thank you, Brent. Have a good night.
You too. See you around. Any other questions before I shut down here? Okay, if there's no questions, by all means, you can just send me an email as well with any questions about anything. Otherwise, I'm going to shut down for tonight. So I'll see you guys Thursday then.
Thank you, Brent.
Yep.
See you.
No problem. See you, Roberto.
Thank
See you,
you.
Hilario. No problem.